There's a moment almost everyone has lived through without ever naming it out loud. Something goes wrong, something small, and before you've even finished the sentence, someone else is already holding the blame. It doesn't happen with anger, and it rarely happens with shouting. It's just a quiet redirection, so smooth you almost miss it happening in real time. I noticed this first in someone I loved, and later I started seeing it everywhere, in people who otherwise seemed calm, reasonable, even genuinely kind. What struck me wasn't the blame itself, but how automatic the whole motion seemed, like a reflex instead of a real choice. He drops something, and somehow it becomes the table's fault for being in the wrong place. He forgets an appointment, and somehow it becomes about nobody reminding him properly beforehand. At first, this looks like simple excuse-making, the kind we all do occasionally under pressure or embarrassment. But the more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't occasional at all. It was constant, almost architectural, as if his entire sense of self depended on never being the one who caused the problem. I kept wondering why admitting a mistake felt, for some people, like something closer to danger than ordinary discomfort. Most of us can say, "That was my fault," and feel a small sting, then move on within minutes without much residue. But for him, that sentence seemed to trigger something much larger, something that looked less like embarrassment and more like genuine fear. And that difference is exactly where the real question begins to take shape. What is actually being protected when someone refuses, again and again, to simply own a mistake? You may recognize this pattern in a parent, a partner, a coworker, or even a version of yourself you don't like looking at too closely. Maybe you've watched someone twist a conversation until somehow you end up apologizing for their behavior instead. That particular trick deserves attention because it reveals something important about how deflection actually works. Blame shifting isn't only about avoiding responsibility for a single moment. It's often about actively relocating that responsibility onto someone else so the emotional weight has somewhere new to land. At first, I assumed this was simple stubbornness, a personality trait like any other quirk. But stubbornness doesn't usually come with the same nervous energy I started noticing underneath it again and again. There's a subtle tension in people who deflect blame, a tightness that shows up right before the redirection happens. It's almost like watching someone brace for impact a split second before swerving a car. That bracing is the small detail that eventually changed how I understood the whole pattern. Bracing implies something is being anticipated as a real threat, not just an inconvenience. And if blame feels like a threat, then we're no longer talking about laziness or plain arrogance anymore. We're talking about self-protection, the same instinct that pulls a hand back from something hot before the brain even registers pain.
Somewhere inside that person, being wrong has been coded as genuinely dangerous, not merely unpleasant or awkward. Once you see that coding clearly, his behavior stops looking careless and starts looking defensive, almost desperate in its quiet, practiced way. Think about family dinners, the ones where a comment about spending too much money turns, within seconds, into a conversation about someone else's past mistakes entirely. Nobody at the table planned that shift, yet it happens smoothly, like a habit worn into the floorboards of the relationship over decades. Everyone adjusts without noticing, learning silently that certain topics will never land where they originally started. That's how blame shifting survives quietly for years without anyone naming it directly, since it never announces itself loudly or dramatically. It simply reroutes the conversation until the original issue disappears entirely from view. I started noticing the same pattern inside marriages, where one partner slowly becomes the emotional shock absorber for the other's mistakes. He forgets the anniversary, and somehow the conversation becomes about how she never reminds him of anything important beforehand. She feels the unfairness immediately, but often can't quite articulate why the logic feels so slippery underneath. That's because the logic isn't actually built to hold up under scrutiny. It's built to end the discomfort quickly, even if it slowly costs the relationship something larger over time. And here's what surprised me the most as I kept watching these patterns unfold. The people I observed doing this weren't cruel by nature or intention. Many of them were generous, funny, even self-aware about other parts of their lives entirely. This wasn't a moral failing in the way we usually imagine one to be. It looked more like an old wound that had never been given the chance to heal properly. It reacted to blame the way a bruise reacts to being touched again. That reframe changed almost everything about how I understood what I was actually seeing. Because if this is a wound instead of a simple character flaw, the real question shifts entirely. It stops being, "Why won't he take responsibility?" and becomes something deeper instead. The real question becomes, what happened long ago that made responsibility itself feel unsafe to hold? Once you start asking that question, the pattern stops looking random and starts looking like a strategy built quietly in rooms most of us never actually saw. Picture a childhood where mistakes weren't met with patience, but with anger, disappointment, or worse, a quiet withdrawal of love. A child raised in that environment learns fast, faster than most adults ever realize. Being wrong doesn't just bring correction in that world. It brings a kind of emotional exile, however brief, however unintentional on the parent's part at the time. So the child adapts the only way children know how, by becoming skilled at avoiding that exile altogether. Blame becomes something to survive rather than something to simply accept and move past calmly. That survival strategy doesn't disappear once childhood ends. It just becomes more sophisticated, dressed up carefully in adult language and adult excuses. The boy who once said, "I didn't do it," to avoid his father's silence eventually grows up. He becomes a man who says, "That's not really how it happened," to avoid his wife's disappointment. The underlying mechanism stays identical across both versions of the story.
Only the audience in the room has actually changed over time. And underneath both versions sits the same terrified child, still trying to outrun the exact same old consequence. This is where the workplace examples start making a lot more sense too. He's the manager who blames the market, the team, the timeline, anyone but the actual decision he personally made himself. Colleagues often assume this comes from arrogance or a bruised ego, and sometimes it genuinely does. But just as often, it comes from someone who learned, long before any job existed, that failure wasn't survivable without deflecting it somewhere else first. I began seeing this even in small-town friendships, the kind built slowly over decades of easy familiarity. Two neighbors argue over something trivial, a fence line or a borrowed tool, and one of them turns it, almost instinctively, into a story about the other person's character instead. It's rarely actually about the fence itself, no matter how loud the argument gets. It's about protecting a self-image that feels fragile the moment it gets questioned directly. And once you notice that fragility clearly, you start noticing it everywhere, hiding just beneath the surface of ordinary disagreements. Maybe you've seen this play out at church gatherings too, where someone's public reputation matters almost as much as their private behavior at home. Blame gets shifted quickly there, almost socially choreographed, because admitting fault publicly can feel like losing standing within a whole community. The fear isn't just personal in those moments, it becomes reputational, layered with an audience that makes honesty feel even riskier than it already did behind closed doors. Retirement brings its own quiet version of this same pattern, one that often surprises people who never expected to see it. He spends decades defining himself through work, and once that structure disappears, small household mistakes suddenly carry an outsized emotional charge. A misplaced set of keys becomes an argument about someone else's carelessness in the house. Underneath that overreaction sits a man quietly afraid of feeling useless, and blame becomes a strange way of proving he still matters. Adult children notice this shift too, sometimes more clearly than anyone else in the family. A father who once seemed steady and even-tempered starts blaming his grown children for calling too little or visiting too rarely. Rarely does he mention the quieter fear underneath those complaints, the fear of becoming forgettable once his usefulness has faded. Blame in that context becomes less about fault and more about a desperate bid for continued relevance and attention. Even something as ordinary as a doctor's appointment can reveal this same pattern quietly at work. He waits weeks to mention a symptom, then blames the doctor's questions for making him feel foolish or exposed. The discomfort was never really about the appointment itself or the doctor's tone. It was about the vulnerability of being examined, of having something in his body simply be wrong without explanation. Blame becomes a shield against that particular kind of exposure. Men who served in the military sometimes carry a version of this that looks almost disciplined from the outside. He was trained for years to never let a mistake slow down the mission or the unit around him. Admitting fault in that world could mean real consequences, sometimes for other people's safety as well as his own. So he learned to move fast past error, to explain it away efficiently and keep going without lingering. Decades later, that same efficient deflection shows up at the dinner table, aimed at something as small as a burnt dinner or a late paycheck. Even something as small as a phone conversation can carry this pattern quietly along with it. He calls to explain why he missed an event, and the story arrives already reshaped before you've asked a single question. Traffic gets blamed, or a coworker, or a scheduling mix-up that somehow was never really his to prevent. You notice, almost immediately, that the explanation arrived faster than the apology ever did. That order, explanation before apology, tells you something quiet about which one actually matters more to him in that moment. And this is where the pattern deepens into something even more unsettling than before. It's not simply that he fears being wrong in any given moment, it's that being wrong has become tangled somewhere in his mind with being unworthy of love altogether. That's a heavier belief than most people carry consciously through their daily lives. Nobody wakes up and consciously thinks, if I make a mistake, I am fundamentally unlovable in those exact words.
But the nervous system doesn't need conscious permission to believe something deeply. It only needs enough early repetition to make the belief feel like settled fact. That's the layer beneath the layer, the one most people never reach entirely on their own. Beneath the excuses, beneath the redirected conversations, beneath even the childhood wound itself, sits a quiet, unspoken terror of abandonment. Blame shifting, at its core, isn't really about avoiding a single mistake. It's about avoiding the emotional consequence that mistake once carried, back when consequences felt existential instead of merely ordinary and survivable. Once I understood that, so much of the behavior I'd been watching finally made sense as one connected story instead of scattered odd habits. The forgotten anniversary, the redirected argument, the blame placed on coworkers, the tension right before deflection happens every time. All of it traced back to the exact same fear, wearing different clothes depending on the situation at hand. Nothing about it was random or accidental in the way it first appeared. All of it was quietly protecting the same fragile, frightened place inside him. You may have lived on the receiving end of this without ever having language for what was actually happening around you. Maybe you spent years absorbing blame that was never really yours to carry, quietly believing something must be wrong with you instead. That confusion makes sense once you realize the deflection wasn't personal in the way it felt at the time. It was a defense mechanism aimed outward simply because looking inward felt entirely unbearable. And maybe, if you're being honest with yourself right now, you've caught yourself doing something similar in smaller ways occasionally. Those are the moments when admitting fault felt like more than you could reasonably handle at the time. That doesn't make you the villain of someone else's story or a hypocrite for noticing it. It makes you human, shaped by your own history of what mistakes used to genuinely cost you. Recognizing this pattern in yourself is often the first uncomfortable step toward finally interrupting it for good. Because here's the quiet truth hiding underneath everything we've walked through together so far. People who constantly shift blame aren't really trying to avoid truth itself in any deep sense. They're trying to avoid the version of themselves that truth used to summon long ago, the unloved, unworthy version formed before they had any real defense against it. Every single deflection is a small act of self-preservation, however damaging it eventually becomes to the people standing closest to them. Understanding that doesn't excuse the behavior, and it certainly shouldn't erase the real hurt it causes in marriages, families, and friendships over time. But understanding does something else, something quieter and maybe far more useful in the long run. It replaces frustration with a kind of clarity, the sort that lets you respond thoughtfully instead of simply reacting on instinct. When you see the fear underneath the deflection clearly, the deflection itself starts losing some of its power over you. Maybe you've been watching someone like him for years, quietly wondering why apologies never come easily in that relationship. Maybe you've noticed how conversations always seem to end up somewhere else entirely, no matter how carefully you tried to steer them. Maybe you've simply misunderstood someone you love, mistaking self-protection for plain selfishness, when really it was always about survival first. Or maybe, without ever meaning to, you've quietly become him yourself, carrying an old fear forward into rooms where it no longer truly belongs. If today's conversation explained why blame moves the way it does, there's another question sitting right behind it, waiting patiently for its turn. What happens to a person who spends decades protecting that same old wound without ever once looking directly at it? That's a conversation worth having next, because this particular story doesn't end here at all. It only opens quietly into the next layer of the same unfolding truth. Thank you for spending this time thinking alongside me today, genuinely. If this helped you understand someone you love, or maybe understand yourself a little more clearly, consider giving it a like before you go. I'd love to know, honestly, whether someone in your life has ever shifted blame in a way that finally made sense after hearing all of this. If conversations like this one speak to you, consider subscribing, because there's always another layer worth exploring together, quietly, one conversation at a time.